On 17th Avenue South, a short walk from the rest of Music Row, there's a gray stone church. It's called Ocean Way Nashville now, the converted sanctuary that quietly shaped the sound of more country records than most people realize. But before it was a recording studio, before Tim McGraw, Faith Hill, and George Strait stood inside it and sang, it was just a building. Gothic revival, built to last. The cornerstone was laid in 1910 by an Episcopal congregation called the Church of the Advent. For most of a century, it did what churches do. Then, for about 5 years at the tail end of the 1990s, it did something else. It made a sound that ended up on a remarkable number of the country records people still remember from that decade, and almost nobody listening had any idea where it came from. The sound is the easiest thing to describe and the hardest thing to notice. When a singer stands in an ordinary recording studio, the room around them is built to disappear. The walls are treated, the corners are trapped, the ceiling sits low and dead overhead. Engineers had spent decades learning how to take a room out of a recording because a room left to its own devices tends to get in the way. By the 1990s, most of Nashville recorded that way, in purpose-built boxes that gave the producer total control and the room no say at all. It was the logical endpoint of a philosophy that had been building since Owen Bradley and Chet Atkins first smoothed the rough edges off country music in the 1950s. The Nashville sound, refined across 40 years until the rooms themselves became instruments of subtraction. The church was the opposite of a box. The sanctuary had a vaulted ceiling and a tall column of air above it, plaster and stone on every side. The kind of space designed 100 years earlier to carry a preacher's voice and a pipe organ all the way to the back pew without any help. Put a band in a room like that, and the room answers back. The sound leaves the instruments, travels up into all that volume, and comes back a fraction of a second later with a soft, natural decay on the end of it. That decay is on the records. It is underneath the vocals and around the steel guitar and behind the snare, and once you know to listen for it, you cannot stop hearing it. How the church became a recording studio is its own strange little story. The Episcopalians stayed in the building until the 1970s, then moved on. After that, it passed through a run of owners that reads like a list somebody made up. A branch of the YMCA used it to house a rehabilitation program. For a while, a theater company remodeled the sanctuary to seat a few hundred people for repertory plays. And then it belonged to a traveling evangelist named Tony Alamo, who ran it as a church of his own while he was, at various points, the subject of federal attention and eventually a federal inmate. So by the early 1990s, the building was sitting on the most valuable music real estate in America. It was owned by a man in prison, and it was waiting for somebody to decide what it was for. That somebody was Alan Sides. Sides had built one of the most respected recording operations in Los Angeles, a company called Ocean Way, which had grown out of a studio he first put together in a garage in Santa Monica at the end of the 1960s. He had learned the craft close to Bill Putnam, the man who more or less invented the modern recording console, and he had a reputation as a meticulous, slightly obsessive engineer, the kind who cared about the exact sound of a room the way other people care about money. He wanted to expand into Nashville. With a partner named Gary Bells, who ran the House of Blues Studios, he found the old church and saw what it could be. What Sides understood, walking through the building, was that he'd been handed something he almost never got. A room nobody had designed for sound, which is to say, nobody had ruined it for sound either. He kept the sanctuary as the main tracking room, big enough to hold an 80-piece orchestra, and tied the church and the old rectory together with glass corridors into 3 studios across about 22,000 square feet. There was a comparison people in Nashville liked to make to RCA Studio B down the street, the room where Chet Atkins had built so much of the Nashville sound in the 60s, or to the old Quonset hut that Owen Bradley had raised on 16th Avenue. Those rooms had become institutions by accumulation, one great session at a time. Ocean Way Nashville was trying to do the same thing, only faster, with the best equipment money could buy pointed at the oldest sounding room in town. The console he installed had 146 inputs, a single continuous desk larger than anything he'd built in a long and well-equipped career, bigger even than the board in his own Los Angeles studio. A desk that size isn't for a singer and a guitar. It's for a whole orchestra tracked live, every instrument on its own channel, all of it caught in one performance in one room at one time. Most of Nashville by then was assembling records in pieces, one part stacked on another across days. Sides built a place designed to catch everything at once, the way records were made a generation earlier. Designing the control rooms from nothing was the part that mattered most to him. For most of his career, he'd inherited rooms, taken over somebody else's studio with the ceilings and corners already set, and spent his energy working around the flaws. The church handed him empty space and a clean sheet. He could place every wall and angle himself and tune each control room to match the live sound of the sanctuary next door. An engineer like him waits a whole career for a chance like that, and most never get it. Ocean Way Nashville opened in 1996. It worked immediately, and it worked because of the timing. The middle and late 90s were the years country music stopped being a genre and became an industry the size of pop. Garth Brooks had already redrawn the map. His records from the early part of the decade had sold in the tens of millions, and they proved that country could compete with anything on any chart. Shania Twain was in the process of doing it again from the other direction, crossing over so completely that the pop audience barely noticed they were listening to a country record. Records were selling in the millions across the board. There was money for the best of everything, and a brand new 5-star studio with the best acoustics in town and a private chef on the roof was exactly the kind of place a label booked for an artist it planned to sell millions of copies of. The man who made the room famous was Tony Brown. By the time Ocean Way opened, Brown was president of MCA Nashville and the most consequential record producer in the city, and arguably in country music anywhere. He had come up as a piano player, backing Emmylou Harris, and before that Elvis Presley, so he had learned how a record sounds from inside the band rather than from behind the glass. His track record is hard to overstate. He made 19 albums with George Strait and 13 with Reba McEntire. He produced Vince Gill through the run of records that made Jill one of the defining voices of the decade. Brooks and Dunn, the biggest duo in country music, ran through his hands too. Across his career, he had a hand in more than 100 #1 singles and in recordings that sold past 100 million copies. At his peak, by one accounting, roughly 1 in every 4 songs in the country, top 20 was something he had produced. When Billboard looked back on the 1990s, it named MCA Nashville the label of the decade, and Brown was most of the reason why. Brown also worked to a schedule. He built each album to deliver 3 hit singles inside a single year, so the radio never went quiet, and the next record was always loading while the last one still played. A man working like that needs a room he can trust completely, one that behaves the same way every time he walks in, and he found it in the church. He brought his biggest artists through its doors, and he said more than once that the acoustics there were the best in Nashville. He also said the food was the best in Nashville, and the people who knew him understood he was not entirely joking. The list of people who recorded in that converted sanctuary is the part that makes the whole thing land. Faith Hill, Tim McGraw, Wynonna and the Judds, Amy Grant, Emmylou Harris, Kenny Rogers, Dolly Parton, Alan Jackson cut sessions there. Some came for the room, others came because Tony Brown was producing, or simply because their label booked the time. Either way, every one of them stood in the same 100-year-old church and sang into the same tall column of air, and the room left the same signature on all of it. Nobody advertised that signature. It is not printed on any album cover. It is just there, in the decay, a property of the building, not the song. If you want to hear it for yourself, start with the slow songs, because that's where the room has the most room to work. Put on Tim McGraw's Please Remember Me from the album A Place in the Sun, cut in that sanctuary in 1999. Listen past the vocal to the space around it, the way the sound opens up behind him and hangs there a moment before it goes. That openness starts in the room itself, the air in a church doing what it had done long before there were microphones to catch it. Then put on Faith Hill. Most of the album called Faith was made in that building, including her recording of The Secret of Life. And when she came back 2 years later for Breathe, part of that record was cut in the same place. On the quieter songs, you can hear a singer standing inside a real space, not in front of a flat wall of effects. The reverb has a shape to it, a slight unevenness, because it belongs to an actual structure with a particular ceiling and particular corners, and no two real rooms ever decay the same way. The clearest example, if you already know the song, is George Strait. Tony Brown produced part of an album of his called Always Never the Same in that church, and the single Write This Down carries the room plainly. Strait had spent his whole career recording in the dry, close, radio-clean Nashville style. Here, his voice is allowed to stand in a space and let the space answer back. It's a small thing, the kind of difference most people would never think to name. And it's the difference between a voice in a box and a voice in a room, and once you've heard the room, the box never quite sounds the same again. The whole arrangement was quietly absurd and worth saying out loud. The most advanced recording console in Nashville, custom built, the size of a small car, sat inside a building that had recently belonged to an imprisoned evangelist, under a roof raised in 1910 by a congregation that would not have understood a single thing about what was being done in their sanctuary. The most modern sound in country music was being made by leaning on the oldest trick there is, a big empty stone room and the way it holds a voice. Nobody set out to make that point. It was just true. And it was not the whole truth, which is the part a careful person has to admit. The church did not record every country hit of the 90s. It opened halfway through the decade. There were other excellent rooms in town, and plenty of the records people love were made elsewhere, in the dead little boxes the church was a reaction against. But for the back half of the 90s, when country was at its biggest and the budgets were at their highest, an unusual share of the music that defined the era passed through that one building and came out carrying that one sound. You have heard it hundreds of times, and nobody ever told you its name. What happened to the room is the ordinary thing that happens to rooms. In 2001, as the music business began its long contraction, a donation from the record executive Mike Curb brought the building to Belmont University. The studio did not close. It became part of a school. Today, the sanctuary is still a working studio and also a classroom, where students learning to be engineers track sessions in the same space those records were made in, and the older engineers who were there hand the room down to people who were not born when it opened. Alan Sides eventually let go of his Los Angeles rooms one by one, but the church kept going under the university's name. It is still standing on 17th Avenue, still gray, still holding a voice the way it was built 100 years before anyone thought to record one inside it.